dead of winter, when the nights stretch endlessly and the cold seems to whisper secrets, there are stories that refuse to be forgotten. Stories that cling to the frost, haunting those who dare to remember. This is not just a tale of survival. It's a story of what happens when isolation becomes more than physical. When fear and the unknown take root in the heart of the coldest nights. Our story begins in 1978, in a remote cabin nestled deep in Alaska's frozen wilderness. A place where the nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only connection to the outside world was a faint radio signal, if the weather allowed it. For one family seeking solace in these frozen woods, the winter would bring something they never expected, and they would leave behind a mystery no one could explain. But what began as a retreat from the noise of the modern world would become a tale whispered in the dark, of things seen and heard, and things no one could ever fully understand. The cabin sat at the edge of nowhere, buried deep in Alaska's untouched wilderness, a place where silence reigned, broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot or the distant crack of ice. The nearest town was over 30 miles away, accessible only by a narrow, snow-covered road that could vanish under a storm in hours. This part of Alaska has always carried an air of mystery. The locals speak in hushed tones about the land, a place they call unforgiving. Stories of travelers disappearing, cabins abandoned with no trace of their owners, and strange sounds that carry on the wind. Whether these were just tales or something more, no one could agree. For centuries, the native communities spoke of the spirits that roamed these woods. Some said the land itself was alive, watching, waiting for anyone who dared to stay too long. Others told of strange lights and figures that appeared during the long nights of winter, never to be seen again once the sun returned. In December 1978, the Mercer family arrived at the cabin. James, a schoolteacher, had always dreamed of living off the land. His wife, Ellen, was less convinced but followed, hoping it might bring the family closer. Their two children, Amy, 8, and Peter, 12, had no choice in the matter. They had come seeking escape from the noise of the city, the pressures of work, and a world that felt increasingly disconnected. This cabin, remote and untouched, was supposed to be a fresh start. What they didn't know was that this isolation would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. The Mercers heard whispers from the townsfolk when they passed through, quiet warnings about staying in the woods for too long, stories of things seen and heard. But James, ever the skeptic, dismissed them as nothing more than folklore. One shopkeeper leaned in as they purchased supplies, her voice barely audible over the creaking floorboards. Sometimes, it's not the cold you have to worry about up there. Just don't ignore the signs. For the first few days, it was everything they had hoped for. Quiet nights by the fire, the children's laughter echoing through the trees. But as the weather began to shift, so too did the atmosphere. It started small, a noise here, a shadow there. But it was only the beginning of something they could never have prepared for. The Mercer family arrived at the cabin with hope and anticipation. But the moment they stepped inside, they were met with something unexpected. A silence so profound, it felt almost unnatural. The cabin had been abandoned for years. Dust blanketed the furniture, and the smell of damp wood lingered in the air. At night, the wind seeped through unseen cracks, making the walls groan as if in protest. The fireplace, no matter how much would James fed it, seemed unable to chase away the cold. It was Peter who first noticed something odd. On their second morning, he found footprints in the fresh snow outside. They led straight to the cabin's front door but stopped there. No trail leading away, no sign of who or what had made them. James dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of the snow or maybe an animal. But Peter couldn't shake the feeling that the prints looked human, too large and heavy to be anything else. Later that night, Ellen swore she heard something tapping on the window nearest their bedroom. She told herself it was just a branch swaying in the wind. But when she looked outside, there was nothing there. No trees close enough to explain the sound. By the end of the week, a blizzard rolled in without warning. The snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the forest in silence. The narrow road leading to the cabin disappeared entirely, leaving the Mercers completely cut off. The radio, their only connection to the outside world, stopped picking up any signal. The days blurred into nights, and the oppressive silence of the storm seemed to stretch on forever. The isolation began to wear on them. Ellen noticed how James had grown quieter, his gaze lingering too long on the darkened forest outside. The children, usually playful, seemed subdued, huddling near the weak fire. And through it all, the feeling that something wasn't right hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. It began slowly, whispers in the dead of night, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps echoed across the wooden floors long after the family had gone to bed. And then there was the tapping, soft at first, then louder, as if demanding to be acknowledged. Objects began to disappear. A lantern that James had set by the door was found hanging outside the cabin, its glass cracked. The children's boots, left neatly by the hearth, reappeared hours later soaked through and crusted with snow. Tensions within the family quickly escalated. James insisted it was their imaginations, the product of isolation and the unrelenting cold. But Ellen wasn't so sure, and the children, Peter and Amy, had begun whispering to each other about the things they'd seen but couldn't explain. Under the strain, cracks began to form. Ellen accused James of refusing to listen, while James grew more irritable, dismissing every incident as nonsense. And in the quiet corners of the cabin, the children shared fears they dared not tell their parents. On the seventh night, the unexplainable became undeniable. James ventured outside during a break in the storm to check the generator. That's when he saw it. A figure, tall and unmoving, standing at the edge of the tree line. He froze, staring at the figure, willing it to move. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching. When he finally ran back inside, his hands shaking, he didn't say a word about what he'd seen. The next morning, Ellen found something tucked away in a drawer beneath a pile of yellowed linens. A worn journal, its pages brittle with age. The entries spoke of the cabin's previous occupants, their descent into paranoia, and the strange occurrences they'd endured. The final entry was barely legible, scrawled hastily, "Don't let it in." As the days dragged on, the family began to unravel. Ellen accused James of keeping secrets about what he'd seen outside. Peter refused to sleep, claiming he heard voices calling his name. Even Amy, the youngest, had grown distant, her gaze lingering too long on the frosted windows. They began to suspect one another. Every noise, every shadow, seemed like proof that anyone was hiding something. What began as unease had grown into full-blown paranoia, and the storm outside showed no signs of stopping. It was no longer just the cold trapping them. It was the fear, the growing certainty that whatever was outside was already inside. On the 10th night, the storm reached its peak. The winds howled like a living thing, and the cabin groaned under the weight of snow and ice. Inside, the Mercers huddled together, fear hanging thick in the air. That's when they heard it. A knock at the door, deliberate and heavy, cutting through the storm's rage. James, against Ellen's protests, grabbed the rifle and approached the door. But before he could open it, the knocking stopped. A moment later, the windows shattered, letting the freezing wind and snow rush inside. In the panic, Peter screamed. Ellen turned, only to see him pointing at the corner of the room. There, where moments ago there was nothing, stood a figure. Its presence cold, its eyes darker than the night. The family realized there was no reasoning with what they faced. It was as though the cabin itself had become a trap, drawing them in and refusing to let them go. James, driven by a desperate need to protect his family, remembered the journal's warning, "Don't let it in." He shouted for everyone to leave the cabin. Even as the storm outside reached a deafening roar, Ellen clutching the children as they flee into the snow, their figures barely visible against the storm's fury. James staying behind, tearing apart the floorboards in search of something buried. A small, weathered box tied with a tattered ribbon. Inside the box was a memento from the cabin's original owners. A lock of hair, a photograph, and a letter describing their descent into madness and their ultimate decision to destroy themselves to stop the horror from spreading. James realized the entity wasn't just tied to the cabin, but to what the box contained. With trembling hands, he hurled the box into the fire, knowing it might be their only chance. The storm seemed to scream as the fire consumed the box. Outside, Ellen and the children watched as the cabin's light flared one last time before disappearing entirely into the blizzard. When the storm cleared the next morning, Ellen and the children found the cabin reduced to ash. There was no sign of James, nor of whatever had terrorized them. Only the empty forest remained, silent and still. Later, authorities found no evidence of foul play. To them, it was just another tragic accident in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. But Ellen knew the truth, knew that something had been watching, waiting, and now it was gone. Or was it? Ellen and the children were found days later, frostbitten and traumatized, by a search party. They survived, but their lives were forever changed. To this day, Ellen refuses to speak of what she saw that night, and Peter and Amy rarely mention the cabin, except in whispers. The official story blames the harsh winter and a failing structure. But some questions remain unanswered. What caused those strange events? Who or what was watching them from the trees? And why were the warnings in that journal so chillingly accurate? Locals still avoid the area, warning travelers to steer clear of the woods. And some claim that on the coldest nights, when the wind carries just right, you can hear faint whispers, calling from where the cabin once stood. What do you think really happened in that cabin? Was it the isolation playing tricks on their minds, or was there something beyond the natural at work? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and explore our other chilling tales. Until next time, stay warm and stay safe.